In the winter of 1885, a farmer in Perry County, Alabama, began selling meat at the Marion town market that nobody could identify. Not the butchers, not the hunters, not even the old plantation cooks who'd prepared every animal from the surrounding woods for 50 years. The meat was tender, sweet, and abundant. And for 3 months, people kept buying it, until they discovered what happened to the tenant farmers who stopped paying their debts. The trouble started when Emmett Wardlaw set up his stall outside the Perry County Courthouse in Marion on a cold Saturday in late November. Wardlaw wasn't known to most folks. He'd moved to Perry County just after the war ended, claiming a small parcel of exhausted cotton land about 8 miles southwest of Marion, near the Cahaba River bottomlands. The land wasn't worth much. The soil had been worked to death by cotton, and most sensible farmers had moved on or switched to raising corn and livestock to survive. But Wardlaw didn't plant cotton. He didn't plant much of anything that anyone could see. Neighbors reported that his property sat mostly empty save for a weathered cabin and a large barn he'd built himself. The barn had no windows. Folks who passed by on the road said they sometimes heard sounds coming from inside. But Wardlaw kept to himself, and people had their own troubles to worry about. What Wardlaw did have was meat. Lots of it. That first Saturday in Marion, he arrived with 4 wooden crates packed with cuts wrapped in brown butcher paper. The meat was pale, almost white, with fine marbling that suggested something raised on good feed. He sold it for 6 cents a pound when beef was fetching 8 and pork was selling for 10. People noticed. By noon, he'd sold everything he brought. The Perry County Medical Examiner's records from December 1885 contain an unusual notation. Dr. Samuel Oates, who served as county coroner and physician, wrote, "Examined sample of meat sold by E. Wardlaw at market. Flesh appears well marbled, fine grain, unable to determine species by visual inspection, texture inconsistent with common livestock. Recommend further inquiry." Dr. Oates never got the chance for that inquiry. 3 weeks after writing those notes, he disappeared while making house calls along the river road. His medical bag was found near Wardlaw's property. His body never was, but the meat kept coming. Every Saturday through December and into January, Wardlaw appeared at the Marion market with more cuts. He never spoke much. When people asked what he was selling, he'd say meat and nothing more. When they pressed about the animal, he'd say it was livestock and change the subject. The price stayed low, and in the hard winter of 1885, when most families were living on cornmeal and whatever they could shoot or trap, cheap meat was a blessing nobody questioned too hard. By January, Wardlaw had regular customers. The meat became popular enough that Marion's only butcher, a man named Hayes Fletcher, felt the competition. Fletcher had apprenticed under his father and knew every cut of beef, pork, mutton, and game that came through Perry County. He bought a pound of Wardlaw's meat to see what he was dealing with. Fletcher's account appeared in a letter to the Perry County probate judge dated January 14, 1886. The letter still exists in county records. Fletcher wrote, "The meat troubles me greatly. I cannot name it. The bone structure, when present, resembles no species in my experience. I have cut hogs for 30 years. This is not pork. I have processed cattle since I was a boy. This is not beef. The fat distribution suggests a creature of considerable size, well-fed, but of unknown origin. I urge investigation of Mr. Wardlaw's operations." Fletcher's letter went unanswered. The probate judge had his own problems. The county was still recovering from the war, and with sharecropping replacing the old plantation system, debt and desperation ran deep. A farmer selling cheap meat wasn't a priority when half the county was on the edge of starvation. But Fletcher couldn't let it rest. He talked to others at the market. A woman named Clara Jessup, who'd worked plantation kitchens before the war, examined Wardlaw's cuts and told Fletcher she'd never seen anything like it. The muscle fibers were wrong, she said. Too long, too smooth. One man, a hunter named Robert Petty, claimed the meat had a smell to it. Not spoiled, but strange. Sweet, almost like fruit. Then the disappearances started making sense. Perry County in 1885 was full of tenant farmers, both black and white, who worked land they didn't own for shares of crops that barely kept them alive. These farmers owed money to furnishing merchants who provided seed, tools, and food on credit at rates that guaranteed debt. When a farmer couldn't pay, they had few options. Some fled in the night. Some kept working, trapped in cycles of debt that passed to their children. Some simply vanished. In the 3 months Wardlaw sold his meat, 7 tenant farmers disappeared from properties within 10 miles of his land. The county sheriff's report from February 1886 lists their names: Jacob Lowe, Samuel Bright, Moses Franklin, Virgil Hunt, Mary Ellen Stroud, Thomas Wade, and Daniel Caruth. All of them owed debts. All of them worked land near the Cahaba bottomlands. All of them were last seen within a mile of Wardlaw's property. No one connected it at first. Tenant farmers disappeared all the time. They ran north, west, anywhere to escape debts. It was the way things worked. But in late January, a sharecropper named Elias Moon came to town with a story that changed everything. Moon had been hunting deer near Wardlaw's property when he saw something through the trees. Wardlaw was leading a man toward the barn. Moon recognized the man as Thomas Wade, a tenant farmer who owed money to half the merchants in Marion. Wade was walking ahead of Wardlaw, not struggling, almost calm. Moon watched them enter the barn. He heard Wade scream once. Then, nothing. Moon's testimony appeared in the sheriff's records dated January 28, 1886. He described waiting in the woods for 2 hours, but Wardlaw never came out, and Wade never emerged. The barn stayed quiet. When Moon finally approached and looked through a crack in the wooden walls, he saw hanging meat, lots of it. But he also saw something else. A boot. Just one, sitting in the corner. It matched the boots Wade had been wearing. The sheriff raided Wardlaw's property on February 2nd, 1886. What they found was documented in testimony later submitted to the circuit court, though the case never went to trial. The barn contained a complete butchering operation. Tables, saws, hooks, barrels of salt. The tools were well maintained and recently used. Meat hung from the rafters, wrapped in cloth. On the floor, they found bone fragments. The sheriff's report contains a chilling detail. Among the bone fragments were pieces that, when assembled, appeared to form a human femur. Dr. Oates's replacement, a physician named Thomas Albright, brought in from Selma, examined the bones. His report, dated February 5, 1886, states, "The remains are consistent with human anatomy. Saw marks indicate deliberate sectioning. The efficiency of butchering suggests significant experience." They found 7 sets of clothing in the barn, 7 pairs of boots, 7 hats. Each set matched descriptions of the missing tenant farmers. They found a ledger too, written in Wardlaw's hand. The ledger listed names, dates, and weights. Jacob Lowe, 162 pounds. Samuel Bright, 178 pounds. Moses Franklin, 145 pounds. The entries continued through all 7 missing people, but they never found Wardlaw. When the sheriff arrived that February morning, the property was empty. The barn doors stood open. Fresh wagon tracks led toward the river road, heading south toward Dallas County. They followed the tracks for 12 miles before losing the trail in Selma. Wardlaw was gone. The Perry County Grand Jury convened in March 1886 to review the evidence. Testimony from Fletcher, Moon, Dr. Albright, and others filled 32 pages of court records. The meat that remained in Wardlaw's barn was tested by 3 separate physicians. All 3 confirmed the same conclusion in their written statements: human tissue, professionally butchered, stored for sale. But without Wardlaw to try, the case went nowhere. The county burned the remaining meat. The barn was torn down. The property sat abandoned, and eventually the county seized it for unpaid taxes. People stopped talking about it. In a region still bleeding from war and struggling through reconstruction, The horror of Wardlaw's barn became something people wanted to forget. What they couldn't forget was the question nobody wanted to answer. How many people had eaten that meat? Fletcher estimated Wardlaw sold between 200 and 300 pounds over 3 months. At 6 cents a pound, that meant over 40 families had purchased his cuts. Church suppers served it. Boarding houses cooked it. Children ate it for Sunday dinner. The realization spread through Perry County like fever. Some families convinced themselves they'd never bought from Wardlaw. Others admitted it but insisted they'd thrown the meat away uneaten. A few people became sick, though whether from guilt or genuine illness, nobody could say. The Methodist Church in Marion held a special service in April 1886 to pray for forgiveness, though the preacher never explicitly said what they needed forgiveness for. Among the old superstitions that ran through Alabama's Black Belt, there was a belief about consuming the dead. The practice, even unknowing, was said to create a bond, a tie between the living and those whose flesh they'd taken. The old folks, many of them former slaves who'd brought beliefs from Africa through the horror of bondage, said that eating the dead invited haunting, not just from spirits, but from something worse, a hunger that never ended. People in Marion started seeing things in February and March of 1886. A woman named Rebecca Stiles reported seeing Thomas Wade standing in her kitchen, though Wade had been missing since January. She'd served his meat, she later admitted, to her family at Christmas dinner. A merchant named John Hastings woke 3 nights in a row to find Moses Franklin sitting at the foot of his bed. Hastings had bought 5 pounds of Wardlaw's meat in December. The Perry County Register, a weekly newspaper, ran a small notice in its March 17, 1886 edition. Residents continued to report strange occurrences following the unfortunate events at the Wardlaw property. While this publication does not endorse superstitious explanations, we acknowledge the community's distress and recommend consultation with religious authorities. But the sightings didn't stop. They multiplied. People who'd eaten the meat reported dreams of being in the barn, hearing screams, seeing Wardlaw's face. Children woke crying about the man with the saw. Dogs refused to enter certain houses. Food spoiled faster than normal. A rot set in, not just in the meat people had stored, but in something deeper. In May 1886, the circuit judge ordered the Wardlaw property burned. Everything. The cabin, the barn foundation, even the trees within 50 feet. They burned it on a Tuesday afternoon, and the smoke hung over Marion for 3 days. People said the smoke smelled sweet, like fruit, like the meat had smelled. The smell lingered in clothes, in hair, in the back of throats. It took weeks to fade. By summer, most of the families who'd bought Wardlaw's meat had either moved away or stopped talking about it entirely. The official story, the one people told outsiders, was that a criminal had operated in Perry County briefly and been chased off. The details stayed buried in court records that most people couldn't read and didn't want to. But there was a second ledger. Fletcher found it hidden in the barn's floor during the initial raid. He never turned it in to the sheriff. In 1903, shortly before Fletcher died, he showed the ledger to his son and told him to keep it safe. The Fletcher family still has it, though they don't show it to many people. The second ledger lists more than 7 names. It lists 43. The entries go back to 1867, 2 years after the war ended. Each entry contains a name, a date, a weight, and a location. They span 8 counties across Alabama's Black Belt: Perry, Dallas, Marengo, Wilcox, Lowndes, Montgomery, Bullock, and Macon. Some entries have additional notes. Paid in full. Debt settled. Unclaimed. The final entry in the ledger is dated January 30th, 1886. The name is Dr. Samuel Oates. Weight, 187 pounds. Location, River Road. The note beside it reads, Last of Marion. Moving south. Wardlaw was never found. No arrest was ever made. The 43 people listed in the second ledger, minus the 7 from Perry County, remained missing. Their families assumed they'd fled debts or died unknown. Most of them were tenant farmers, people already invisible to the systems that govern their lives. Their disappearance barely registered in official records. But the stories persisted. Throughout the 1890s and into the early 1900s, rumors circulated about a farmer selling cheap meat in small towns across the Black Belt. The details were always similar: pale meat, good quality, low price. A quiet man who kept to himself. A barn with no windows. People who bought the meat and later wished they hadn't. The accounts were never confirmed. Sheriffs in Dallas County investigated a similar case in 1891, but found nothing. A report from Wilcox County in 1897 described a meat seller matching Wardlaw's description, but by the time authorities arrived, he was gone. The trail went cold in Macon County in 1903, where a farmer named Edward Ward sold meat at the Tuskegee Market for 6 weeks before vanishing. The Macon County Sheriff's report noted that Ward bore a strong resemblance to descriptions of Emmett Wardlaw, but 18 years had passed, and nobody could be certain. The last confirmed sighting came from Sumter County in 1908. A traveling preacher passed through the town of Livingston and mentioned, casually, to the local Baptist minister that he'd seen a man selling meat at a crossroads market who looked remarkably like someone from an old wanted poster. The Sumter County Sheriff investigated, but found only an empty market stall and wagon tracks heading west toward Mississippi. After 1908, the story stopped. Whether Wardlaw died, moved beyond Alabama, or simply disappeared into anonymity, nobody knows. What remained was the legacy of Perry County, the families who'd eaten the meat and couldn't forget, the children who grew up hearing warnings about strangers selling food, the deep suspicion of anything that seemed too good, too cheap, too easy. The property where Wardlaw's barn stood stayed empty for decades. The county tried to sell it multiple times, but nobody would buy land with that history. Trees grew back. The burned ground healed. But people in Marion still avoided it. Old women said the land was cursed, that nothing would grow right there, that animals avoided it. In 1954, a developer from Montgomery finally purchased the property, planning to build rental houses for the growing number of people moving to Marion for work. Construction crews broke ground in July. They lasted 3 days before walking off the job. The foreman reported that workers kept finding bones in the soil, small fragments, scattered and old. The state archaeologist examined the site and determined the bones were human, but too degraded and fragmentary to determine age or identity. The project was abandoned. The land sits empty today. You can find it if you know where to look, about 8 miles southwest of Marion near the Cahaba River bottomlands. It's marked on modern maps as Wardlaw Road, though most locals call it something else. They call it the Meat Farmer's Land, and they don't go there after dark. The second ledger, the one with 43 names, was donated to the Alabama Department of Archives and History in 1967 by Fletcher's grandson. It sits in a temperature-controlled vault in Montgomery, available to researchers by appointment. Most people who study it focus on the historical aspects, the economic desperation of the Reconstruction era, the vulnerability of tenant farmers, the breakdown of social systems after the war. But a few researchers, the ones who spend time with those court records and testimony, notice something else. The handwriting in the ledger is neat, methodical, practiced. The dates are precise. The weights are detailed to the pound. And the final entry, the one dated January 30th, 1886, isn't actually the final entry. There's one more line, added later in different ink. No name, no weight, no location. Just a date, December 14th, 2025, and next to it, a single word, ready.